But I think the other piece of it is if it is, let's just say, a new director, right? They need to spend the time to ask the questions. What are their challenges? Like, even in a brand new job, I'm still going to sit down with a director and say, what are your challenges? How can I help? What are some of the things that have happened in the past with our department that have frustrated you, right? Get that laid out on the table.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now it's time to roll back and start the first case.
On this episode of First Case, we speak with Suzi Collins, Market Director of Supply Chain for the Arizona sites at Steward Healthcare. Melanie, we've done a surprising number of conversations on the First Case podcast about supply chain, but since about 2020, it's been a really important conversation because it's so impactful on the day-to-day experience for the front lines and definitely a strain on management and leadership in the OR as well. And we're going to talk in this season of communication about how to effectively communicate with supply chain. And we're going to learn a thing or two from Suzi as well.
Yeah, we are. Because I think of my own experience, I was very much thrust into OR leadership very early in my OR experience. And I didn't know who to talk to, and I certainly didn't know how to talk to them and who the right people were, any of that. And it was very foreign to me, and I was figuring it out as I went. So I think a conversation like this is incredibly helpful, not just for OR staff to understand how things really come into play and how we get what we need, but those leaders in the OR, especially if you're new and don't understand who to talk to, Suzi's going to help you figure that out because she's got a lot of wisdom and advice to share.
Well, sharing is the biggest thing. One of the most impressive aspects of Suzi Collins, and you'll see this if you're already following her on LinkedIn, is the fact that she is incredibly willing to share all of her knowledge and insights for the betterment of healthcare. And so we're going to be back with a dynamic individual after a short break. Suzi Collins up next.
I'm Melanie Perry.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A 17 Studios production, you're listening to First Case.
We're talking with Suzi Collins, Market Director of Supply Chain, the Arizona sites at Steward Healthcare. And Suzi, it's great to talk to you. We see you all over LinkedIn. You're doing a great job educating the healthcare supply chain world. And I know you've done a decent amount of travel as well, and you've been on some of our other podcasts, including Power Supply, which is the supply chain podcast. But this season, you may or may not know in your conversations with Melanie, is dedicated entirely to communication. And so we've come at this from a lot of different angles, but today's is going to be communication between the operating room and listeners, you guessed it, supply chain. And so, Suzi, I'd love for you to talk about your background for our audience, because as I've gotten to know you, I know you've worn a lot of hats throughout your career.
Mm-hmm. I have, and it's crazy because I'm only like 25, but kidding. So I've spent over 30 years in the acute care market. And I actually started out working for a gentleman that sold surgical lights and tables and ended up working my way into sales. So sold Skytron surgical lights and tables. That led into head wall systems, specialty storage, inventory management, all of these things that just brought me further and further into the world of healthcare. So I've I started out, if you will, in the operating room. So it's always been very near and dear to my heart. And both from a sales standpoint and a consulting standpoint, it is definitely, one of the primary things in my wheelhouse. So I've also, was fortunate enough to do projects both at UPMC Presbyterian and WVU in Morgantown, specifically around the operating room. So it has a special place in my heart.
Well, and I've seen you take a lot of those concepts and bring them to TikTok and videos on LinkedIn and sharing some of those best practices because, honestly, one of the worst things that can happen in the OR is to not have the supplies they need to get the surgery off on time and without issue. And so supply chain's important. And we've had several different conversations tying into supply chain in the past, but we've only really lightly touched on it, the communication between the two departments. So let's just set the table in case somebody hasn't listened to some of our prior episodes. I'm thinking of a conversation with Dan Pfister, and we've had some preference cards conversations as well. But how does supply chain do business? Like, help the OR understand the depth and breadth of supply chain.
Yeah, that's actually a great question because I think, unfortunately, we compete. I joke and I always say we're not Amazon, but we're competing with a world that is used to Amazon where they can ask for something, think about it, order it, and it's on their doorstep tomorrow. So I think one of the most important things is to understand that healthcare is nowhere close to having that type of technology and that type of advancement in how we do the work. So the biggest thing that's important for listeners to know is that we need time, we need planning, and we need transparency in what's needed in the OR because we can't just easily make it show up tomorrow. We've got very tight deadlines. A lot of places, especially I'm on the West Coast, right? So a lot of companies that are on the East, we typically can't get something out next day air if it's after 2:00 in the afternoon Arizona time. So there's a lot of things that make purchasing and managing of the supplies very challenging in the operating room. And even the fact that you can even order something for next day air delivery, but it doesn't mean that you're going to get it early enough for the case. So there's challenges, and I think it's just important that we level set that. Another big thing, and we've seen it multiple times this year, is heaven forbid Memphis get bad weather, because that once we see FedEx thrown off, you can't come back from that. So I think that just having that very transparent relationship with the operating room so that we're not doing things in the last minute, it's going to happen. But we don't want that to be the norm. That should be 20% of the time, and 80% of the time we should be ahead of that schedule.
Okay, so actually I want to ask about that because, typically we want things 5 minutes ago, or the room is asking for something and it, isn't here but needed to be here. We've had we've all experienced multiple issues with availability of supplies. You bring up, Memphis or any other area that's had supply chain disruptions that have affected other people across the country. But what's a normal time span? You say you need time to make sure that you have what you need, but what is normal? What is that time frame?
So we really use, at least for my work that I do in the operating room, is we really press that 72-hour window. In a perfect scenario, when you're managing the block schedule of a physician, the expectation is to try to have that 72 hours. We know that emergent cases come in, and for those things, obviously, we want to plan ahead and have the appropriate par level on the shelf to deal with both normal volume and just in case. But it's when those requests come in suddenly for the next morning and they come in at 2:00 in the afternoon, and I just sit there and smile and go, okay, we can't really make that happen, right? And then we end up either trying to borrow or whatever it might be, and that's not where we want to be. So some of it's changing the behavior of the physicians, because oftentimes it's not necessarily an emergent case as much as they want to do it the next day. And that's where sometimes we get into this kind of, a little bit of a shoving match, if you will, between supply chain and the OR, in that they just want to make police a physician, but we can't turn around and need that quickly. And without fail, again, they're scheduling it at 7 o'clock in the morning, which doesn't even allow us time to physically speak. Like, the other thing that people don't think about is, yes, we are in the greater Phoenix area, right? But we are considered almost rural because we are that far away from the FedEx hub. So the distance from the hub, if I order something for a 10:30 delivery, they technically have until 12:30. Now, do they try to get it to me? Yes. But I don't necessarily get things by 10:30. It's kind of so we often have that conversation in the OR because they're like, what if we schedule it after 10:30? And I'm like, I can't promise you until 12:30. We just don't want to be in that situation. And it comes down to my team being able to look at the schedule, sitting down with the charge nurse, sitting down with the service line specialist, looking at the schedule, being as proactive as we can, and communicating with the physician offices.
Yeah, that scheduling piece, boy, is that tough. There's really not a lot of good technology options out there today to help us with it, right? It's a very manual effort piece, and you're not necessarily employed by the same people, and and sometimes when changes happen, one side is not informing the other.
Yeah, it's a challenge. But like I said, it's one of the reasons, though, too, that we stay very intimate with the OR schedule. All of my staff knows how to look at the operating room schedule. They may not know what every procedure means, but they know if they suddenly see a cysto doctor, a urologist that's on the schedule, he's got 8 cases, boom, boom, boom. That's going to alert them that, hey, I need to look at some of those supplies. So we try to be, and just that communication, again, with the charge nurses, with the folks running the desk, with anesthesia, if we suddenly see a lift in cases, that's also going to be a lift in other things as well. So we just really are hyper-focused on being part of their team. They go to the huddle. We have a separate huddle at 2 o'clock. We just try to participate as much with the OR as we can.
Yeah, being present just helps foster positive communication in general. You're going to hear things that maybe you needed to know that nobody thought you needed to know. And, that alone, just having some eyes and ears regularly can be so helpful. Now, when we talk about the physician's offices, that's really like triangulating communication, right? Because that scheduling isn't happening in the OR. It's not everybody together. Another place we get triangulated is with the vendors too. And so, you mentioned finding out about a case at 7 a.m. Sometimes the supplies are coming in last minute too, and there's coordination with multiple departments. Do you think sometimes, just the communication from the OR to the vendor to supply chain that all have sort of a hand in that, and really sterile processing too. But that triangulation, I feel like that's another area when, especially as it still comes down to scheduling and having supplies, very much a supply chain kind of oversight and responsibility. Does that create some breakdowns in communication as well?
It does. I would love to sit here and say that, vendors are always going to be 100% forthcoming with information, but there are times that we've had situations where they will show a physician literally something on a Thursday and he suddenly decides he wants to use it on Friday. And I'm like, nope, we're not going to do that, because it doesn't even give us time to build out the appropriate CDMs, right? So sometimes they're doing it, quite honestly, as a tactic, hoping that they can get it in. But we've made it extremely clear with our vendors that, we follow our contracts, we follow process. And honestly, if they come in with something that is not approved, I will be thanking them for their donation. Period.
That might be one of the best ways to handle it, is the donation side of it versus disrupting things. And I've seen that in a lot of vendor policies across the country is if you bring in an approved product, you inherently are accepting the responsibility for non-payment because it's in our policy. You've acknowledged the policy. And then that way you don't put the surgery and the patient and the surgeon and the OR in a precarious position about staying with the schedule that day. And then you have to address it on the back end. But let's say, something comes in that's not approved, that you also don't have, the appropriate resources to maybe like sterilize it or those kinds of things. And then you say, I got to put a stop on the procedure. How do you communicate that effectively to the OR, that may be very upset about that? And, sometimes we can find ourselves in the finger pointing, and we've had so many different conversations around how to avoid the finger pointing. So how do we make that a constructive conversation for all parties involved?
Well, and I do think it comes back to the day-to-day conversation and the day-to-day partnership, because if you only show up to say no, or you only show up to kind of be the bad guy, of course, it's not going to be, it's not a healthy relationship, right? So instead, if we already all understand where I lie with what I'm asked to do by corporate supply chain, they all know the policy, we all agree of the value of the policies, it's less likely that there's going to be, shall we say, anger with the decision. Because what I find is sometimes I end up coming back and saying, you could say yes to this if you want to. We could make it work. So you could do a one-off. But if you do, you're also opening the ground that he may say, but you let me use it, right? So we'll have that dialogue back and forth. But I think the difference is when you choose to have, because I'm still very involved, but even my manager is involved with the OR, my team is involved, we stay a part of the operating room. And I do think that that's a big part of why we have such a good working relationship and a good partnership. And I think people who are listening to this, they really need to ask themselves, is it a partnership? Or does it feel more like a dictatorship that switches, right? Because sometimes it's the OR dictating and sometimes it's supply chain dictating, right? And we know that's going to happen. So I think that that's what the listeners need to really think about is what is their relationship right now?
So actually, I'm glad that you said relationship, because I want to walk that back a little bit to talk more about your personal experience with building that relationship with the operating room. I mean, you said y'all go to huddles, your team is looking at the schedule. Can you dive a little deeper into how you really got to know your OR directors, OR managers, and really built that relationship up?
Yes. And I do think that I have a little bit of an advantage because of what I've done, and I'm very comfortable in the operating room. So it doesn't freak me out. I can watch a case, all those things, right? So I've spent enough time in the operating room. But I think the other piece of it is if it is, let's just say, a new director, right? They need to spend the time to ask the questions. What are their challenges? Like, even in a brand new job, I'm still going to sit down with a director and say, what are your challenges? How can I help? What are some of the things that have happened in the past with our department that have frustrated you, right? Get that laid out on the table. I think the second piece of it is that, and I do this with my team, is to really reiterate to them that sometimes the way that somebody may come off to them shouldn't be like, they shouldn't say, wow, so-and-so is mean, because they have to realize that they're probably playing off of a physician being upset about something and they're kind of passing it on. So we have a lot of discussion about not taking those things personally, but remember that we're doing a service for them. And that at that moment in time, the customer is always right, even if they're not. No, but they are always right. And that we have to respond with the urgency that the OR is used to working in. And we need to respond with be as positive as we can to them. Say, hey, I don't know the answer right now. Please give me a chance to go do some research for you. Whatever it is, never tell them you don't have it. Never tell them you don't know. Just figure it out and then go to one of your leaders and get the help, right? But I think it's helping to educate their world to our world. And I think that's a big part of it. And I think it's a part that's missing. I hired somebody fairly new, and one of the first things I asked is, have you seen any OR cases? Have you, and they're like, well, a little bit, but kind of from afar. And I said, so, depending on your comfort level, I'd like you to just observe. Because I think it's important that we understand their world. Just like I had that same person go watch sterile processing that was doing the ordering for sterile processing so they can understand, what are they doing with the wrap? What are they doing with the tape? Everything. You've got to understand their world. And I think that's the most important thing. And then I do education about how we do business, right? That's the other piece of it, is them understanding that there's going to be things that I need more, I need more time on. They're an East Coast company, so my cutoff is going to be 2. Those types of things, we just continue to educate all the time how we do business as well.
That's really insightful. I think the whole idea about understanding their world and really understanding someone's world really is that two-way street in communication, and really understanding what's going on, either what's going on in supply chain or what's going on OR, SPD, whatever department it might be. But that actually leads to the thought, okay, so an OR director, they need equipment, they need materials, they need something, and they have to communicate those needs, and they have to do it. They can't just walk in and say, I need this and be done. They have to really effectively communicate what they want and pay attention to their audience, right? So how does an OR director effectively communicate what they need when they're talking to supply chain?
Great question. So we have 2 different worlds, right? We've got supplies that are needed, and then we have equipment. So on the supply side, sometimes they're going to be like, Dr. Jones says he has to have this for the case. It's like $5,000. I'm going to encourage them to have a discussion with their leader. I have to bring up some of the hard points. Do we know what the reimbursement is for that case? Have we done that case? Do we know if he's credentialed to do that procedure? Because if it's something brand spanking new, there are questions that we have to ask. And typically, once I start asking those kind of questions, they realize it's a deeper conversation than just trying to appease the physician, right? So I just try to help them think about it more strategically. When it comes to equipment, of course, there's all kinds of things that we want, right? We need new OR tables, we need lights, we need new towers from Stryker, all these things. When it comes to that, I encourage the OR directors to really understand their business. What are they generating in revenue? What service lines are going to utilize that room, utilize that tower, utilize that technology? Is the request coming from, quite honestly, a surgeon that carries a lot of influence? Or is it coming from a surgeon that doesn't bring us a lot of volume? They've got to be prepared to tell a good story. And telling a good story is very important because, honestly, I can't respond to I want. I can't. We would be in trouble. So I can't really respond to that. I have to have a better story to help me understand why they're making the request. And that, again, is an education that, because even, if something's going to be a capital request, I talk to them about the business objectives that they're going to have to fill out. And I do make suggestions to them, and I remind them to lean on their vendors for the right information, not necessarily marketing, but even, do we know if 3 of the other hospitals are using it in town, right? Is it going to help us gain business? All of those things are really important for an OR director to understand. It helps with the story.
Okay, so I want to actually just ask you, more detail on what the story would look like, but I don't really know if there's more detail to go into that. Because can we be more granular on telling a story, or maybe an example? Can I ask that, or some stories you've heard that help?
Yeah, you just did. Keep going.
Yeah. Yes, you can ask that. So, for example, we had a request for a very specialized machine that helps to let the breast surgeon know that the margins are clear, right? So I will say that that was more of a want, and in the way this story came through, there was going to be a lot more cases. As it turns out, we didn't get the volume that we expected for what the machine cost. So it kind of put us into a difficult situation when it came up for renewal. And we made the decision to not continue that machine because the volume wasn't there. So when I say that they really need to understand the usage, they're going to need to have a conversation with the physician to really understand the cases. They're going to need to understand what are the CPT codes that are going to be used for the billing, and to go to finance and ask them what is the reimbursement for those CPT codes. They're going to need to, when it comes back to volume, if it's something that, let's just say it's something that an orthopedic surgeon is asking for, right? And just one wants it, but then the potential is going to be there that when it's used, other people may want it, and now suddenly one isn't going to be enough. You've got to think through that before you're asking for stuff, because once you have the ask, right, and you're given it, getting it the second time around actually is not as easy, right? Because now you're waiting a whole nother year for another budget. So it's really just getting that information, but you want to tell a story that's also going to be, that is going to make sense to finance, because it's not really, I guess the other important thing to realize is it's not so much supply chain making all of those decisions. It really is about finance and your budget. You may only have a certain amount of capital budget. You may only have a certain amount of supply spend. And that's the other piece of it. I've had something come in to the service line, let's say partway through the year, and I have to remind the director, this is going to cause our spend every month for the rest of the year to be over. There may be a great reason for that because it's going to be supported by the volume. But let's just say, like, for instance, on that other product, I was taking the hit on supplies and a rental of the machine, and then I didn't see the volume change to help compensate for that. So it was pure expense without any revenue hitting against it.
Yeah,
so
with low volume, there's really no profit because there's a baseline cost. So you actually have to figure out, and, as a manager with business experience, you have to look at it and say, we have to do at least this many procedures. And then you almost have to go back to the surgeon and say, can you guarantee this volume? So that they think twice about, well, wait a second, I'm only doing this in 10% of my cases, and I'm only doing this many cases. You know what? We're going to need 2 other surgeons with a similar case volume as me to make this work. But you almost have to feed it back to them to help them think through it, because there's going to be clinical benefits. But right now, and I'm glad you brought up, the CPT codes and the finance piece, a big trend in supply chain is connecting to rev cycle now, which was always isolated, which is what's happened is we've all been in these little silos, and that's why healthcare loses money sometimes. And you don't want to turn patient care into a complete business, and clinicians will really struggle with that. At the same time, can't deliver care if we're cash poor and losing money. Ultimately, you're going to close services, you're going to close hospitals, and that is ultimately, in a grand scale, going to cause lots of issues for patients. And it's kind of where we're at now. And we're used 20 years ago to sort of like, you get whatever you need because the profit margins are so high. And it's just not the business of healthcare. We're actually running out of time. I can't believe how fast this is going. But I want to talk about back orders and stockouts, but I really do want to set it up with just a simple question, right? When we talk about supplies, and we just talked about volume, but volume in terms of like, if we buy something, how many times are we going to use it and utilization? I want to talk about volume in terms of the SKUs. Like, what kind of volume of supplies are we talking about for an average hospital? Maybe 500 beds, 10 to 20 ORs. what kind of SKUs are we talking about just dedicated to the operating room? Can you just give us like a round guess or estimate?
I would say that size of a hospital, they're probably looking at 1,500 to 2,000 SKUs, depending on what they're doing in the vascular world, because vascular has a lot of different shapes and sizes for anatomy. So it's a lot of different products. And one of the things that we always look at too, and this is important for your listeners, is what you're asking me to bring in going to take something else off my shelf, or am I adding something new? Because when we just continue to add something new, versus, we inflate our inventory.
Yeah. So it's growing and it's not necessarily efficient, and they might be like, but not same. But if you can't replace it, then there's, again, lots of different products that are doing this, essentially serving the same function, but it becomes very difficult because now you have 5 of those inventories to manage instead of 1. So you're creating a very inefficient situation logistically. Now, when we say SKU, that's an order number. So that's literally like each individual product. And it could be a very huge, like a very minor difference, like literally 5.5-inch mayo and a 6-inch mayo each have their own SKU.
Yep. And that's why I said too, depending on service lines, there's a lot of different balloons and sizes and catheters that, you may have a large volume. So it's again, that's why that open communication is so important between supply chain and the operating room. One, we want to effectively manage what you have today. We want to know we want to anticipate what you're going to need for the next, really, we work about 5 to 7 days out of looking at the schedule, making sure we have enough custom packs, all of the drapes and gowns, everything that we keep on the shelf. Then the secondary piece to that is, what specialty things might we need? What are we anticipating vendors bringing in? All of those sorts of issues. So it's complex. And then when we do just have a tendency to add new, it also inflates your on-hand value. So again, if I inflate my value between last October and this October, and I don't have the revenue to support my increase, my finance people are going to ask questions. Why do you have $500,000 more on your shelf and your revenue is stagnant? So that's where it's very important to know your business, not just what you're spending, but what is your department making?
So you brought up something in my OR brain. I don't know. I think I had trauma flashbacks, but in communicating those SKUs, those SKUs, those order numbers with your OR team, when maybe there's a back order or there's a stock out or something's not here, I cannot tell you how many emails I got. And those emails said, this number is out of stock. I don't know what that number is. I have no idea, because that's not the world I work in. And so I would get an email with 5 or 10 different numbers of things that I'm like, what the heck is this? And so then I've got to go find out, oh, that was Raytex, or oh, that was 4x4s, or that was this or that. So when it comes to communicating, yes, I firmly agree that communication has to be open between the two departments. But it really helps if we're using the same words or we're actually communicating in a way that both departments understand, right?
Yep. And we have a tendency to we always communicate it with part number and description. We also try to communicate it to whomever's impacted. Is it urology? Is it cardiac? Who's impacted? But then they also keep a board. So they actually have a very good plan, because they take it from what we tell them and they actually write what they call it.
That is nice.
So it actually works. And we do visual back order stickers on every single product. So there may still be some left in the bin, but we get the visual on there as well. So it's extremely clear that when these are gone, we might not have a replacement. And then if we do sub something that is different, we also always flag that there's a sub in the bin, so they don't think it's just something wrong. We want them to know it was a conscious decision for us to put a sub in there.
So you kind of just answered my next question, but before we go there, because we've got like 2 minutes left, we're like at the end of time, but I want to fit in a couple of things, because I want to go back to the back orders piece and kind of like what Melanie was talking about. And I want everybody to understand we really got put in this like catch-22 because we talked about how many SKUs and the volume and trying to get it from 5 products down to 1. And then all of a sudden we hit the pandemic and we have these back orders. And not only does supply chain now have to manage all the back orders and trying to figure it out, but they might have just completed a job that took them like 6 years leading up to the pandemic to get 5 down to 1. And now they're going from 1 back to 5 so that they have, substitutes that are acceptable when there's a back order. And I think it's really important, like that yo-yo for supply chain was incredibly difficult because it literally undid years of hard work and communication with surgeons to start to get that sort of efficient level of inventory. And so finally, I'm going to bring it back to visually communicating, which you just talked about with like the bins and if there was a substitute in a back order and everything else. But as we wrap this up, I want you to talk about the impact, like you're communicating not only verbally and through communication, but literally the actual supply chain process has more information communicated just by it inherently how you built the system. But what impact has that had as we kind of close this up? What impact has that had for the operating room to be able to know more without having to ask somebody?
I think that it helps because they don't feel like we're surprising them anymore. Because unfortunately, there was a period of time where we were surprising them because we thought we were getting in the next morning, it wasn't there, right? So I think that it's helped with the what I call back order fatigue, right? It's helped that they can visually see it. We're giving them information in email. We're giving it to them in a book. They're moving it to their board. We're all on the same page. So it's helping them to believe us more because I think there was a time when they just stopped hearing it. They didn't want to hear the word back order anymore. And we've normalized it, if that makes sense.
Well, it kind of does. And a lot of times would joke, oh, no, they didn't. It's not back ordered. They just forgot to order it. And they're telling us it's back ordered. And that's a terrible perception to have of the department that is making sure you have what you need. But that back order fatigue and that frustration was real. And it is real. And I think those were legitimate feelings, even if it wasn't very nice for people to say it. But,
Right. And I think that even though I think them seeing the effort that we're putting into it makes it helps us set the stage for them believing us. They don't think that we didn't order it, right? I mean, I think that's again, we gained a lot of notoriety, I can't talk today, through COVID. And I think people understand what we do so much more now than ever before. And especially in the operating room. And I think that they know that we're doing our best to keep it going.
Well, you talked about shadowing, and, I think that is all about making sure we're not operating in a silo or with blinders on and understanding a little bit of the bigger picture. But I think to your point, the pandemic certainly helped people understand the importance of supply chain, see them more, and really start focusing on collaborating. And so I'm going to take something that you said earlier about how your team is going to huddles and being present. I'm going to flip the script a little bit for our audience on that. That's something that you've done very proactively from a supply chain leader. I'm going to say, to those OR managers and directors and VPs, peri-op VPs, go to your supply chain people and invite them to the huddle so that your OR can work more efficiently and we can, increase this communication, because the collaboration between OR and supply chain has never been more important or more strained. So the only way to work on that is effective communication and collaboration. So Suzi, your background is amazing, and, your work and everything that you've been doing to share, you're not hiding that information and using it solely to your advantage. You've done a lot of work to educate and give simple, easy ideas to the industry so that everybody can survive kind of the fallout of what's happened over the last several years. So I just want to thank you for that and for coming on the show.
Definitely. I really appreciate you guys having me.
Absolutely. Thank you.
That was Suzi Collins, Market Director of Supply Chain for the Arizona sites at Steward Healthcare. And Melanie, one of the things that I kind of like caught on to that we didn't follow up on during that entire interview, which lots of great information. I obviously have some understanding of supply chain and have spoken with Suzi in the past, but she's inspiring on social media and she would love it if you connected with her. So just look up Suzi Collins on TikTok and LinkedIn and you'll see lots of great content if you want to learn more on the heels of this conversation. But something that she said really stuck out to me, and I'd like to get your thoughts, Melanie, but there are different paces of play for different departments. And I loved how she said that she coaches her supply chain team or materials managers, whatever level they're at, to match the urgency of the OR. That is, not necessarily a takeaway for our OR audience on here, but it is a really important point, I think, for successful collaboration. And maybe there's a way to kind of communicate that out as a best practice to supply chain. Like if you're working in here, you kind of need to be able to keep pace with all the craziness that's going on.
100%. And hearing her say that was just like, oh, that's amazing. I love that, because what I have experienced in my own career has not been a department matching our energy or matching our urgency, because we are just a fast-moving, fast-paced department. What it felt like every time we were communicating was that we were suddenly, we're the hare and they're the tortoise kind of thing. And it was slow and we couldn't get what we needed, or it was people dragged their feet. And it really had to do, I think, with a bad relationship and poor communication between our departments. But that is so insightful to instruct your team to match their energy. But then on the OR side, tell your stories, communicate, know your audience, and actually come to the table with the information that they need to help you make decisions. So very helpful advice.
Telling the story, really a key one. I loved that. All right, that's it for this show, but a great season we've been having on communication and talking about communication with supply chain today. I do want to tell you all that the best way to communicate with the First Case team is to find us on LinkedIn and Facebook and comment on these episodes if you're learning from something. And I got to say, Melanie, one of the most engaged group is our perioperative audience. Of all the podcasts that I do, I can tell you that we get the most comments from the First Case listeners. And so I want to encourage that. Also, if there's something you don't want to post publicly, you can just send us an email to info@firstcasemedia.com and definitely download our smartphone app. Just search for First Case on the App Store or Google Play. It's available for Apple and Android. And then finally, if you're already listening to podcasts on another app, certainly search for First Case. You'll find us there. And finally, on behalf of Melanie and myself, thanks for listening to this week's episode of First Case.